The champagne was flowing at the Waldorf Astoria, but Emily Sterling's face was the color of curdled milk. She had just swiped her exclusive black card to cover the charity auction's $2 million grand prize, and the terminal blinked back two impossible, humiliating words: account frozen. Across the ballroom, nursing a club soda, stood her daughter-in-law, Josephine, the girl everyone in Manhattan high society swore was a penniless gold digger. As Emily's phone began to buzz with frantic alerts from 6 different offshore banks, Josephine slowly raised her glass in a silent, chilling toast. The trap hadn't just snapped shut, it had obliterated them, and they had invited her right through the front door. To the outside world, Josephine Calloway was nothing more than a pretty girl with dirt under her fingernails. She ran a modest, struggling boutique floral shop in Brooklyn, specializing in rare orchids and wildflowers. She drove a 10-year-old Volvo, lived in a cramped walk-up, and wore thrifted sweaters that smelled faintly of eucalyptus and damp earth. When Theodore Sterling, the golden boy and heir apparent to the Sterling Global Investments empire, walked into her shop one rainy Tuesday, looking for an apology bouquet for his mother, the narrative practically wrote itself. Theo was charmed by her apparent lack of interest in his Rolex and his bespoke Italian suit. He was mesmerized by her quiet intensity, her unassuming beauty, and the way she entirely failed to recognize his infamous last name. Within weeks, they were inseparable. Within 3 months, there was a 7-carat emerald-cut diamond on Josephine's finger. The tabloids devoured it. Page 6 ran a spread, calling it the ultimate Cinderella story, though the whispers in the exclusive country clubs of the Hamptons were far less generous. To the old money elites, Josephine was a predator, a highly skilled, beautifully disguised gold digger who had managed to sink her claws into the city's most eligible billionaire bachelor. No one believed this more fervently than Theo's family. The Sterling patriarch, Harrison, was a man who viewed human beings entirely as assets or liabilities. His wife, Emily, was a terrifying socialite whose smile could cut glass, and whose approval was the only currency that mattered on the Upper East Side. Then there was Brenna, Theo's younger sister, a spoiled heiress whose primary occupation was making the lives of the help utterly miserable. The first time, Josephine was invited to the Sterling estate, a sprawling, limestone fortress in Greenwich, Connecticut, she was subjected to an interrogation disguised as a polite dinner. "So, Josephine," Emily purred, slicing into her Wagyu beef with surgical precision. "Theo tells us you arrange flowers. How quaint. I suppose it must be a nice hobby to occupy your time. But how on earth do you manage the rent in this economy?" "It pays the bills, Mrs. Sterling," Josephine replied smoothly, keeping her voice soft, submissive. "Barely, sometimes, but I love the work." Brenna snorted into her wine glass. "Well, you won't have to worry about bills anymore, will you? Theo is so generous. He bought his last girlfriend a Porsche just for existing." Theo bristled, setting his fork down. "B, that's enough. Josie isn't like that." "Of course she isn't," Harrison boomed, though his eyes were completely devoid of warmth. "But as a man of wealth, Theodore, you must understand the practicalities of bringing someone from outside our sphere into the fold. Wealth attracts parasites, my boy. It is the nature of the beast." Josephine didn't flinch. She simply smiled a fragile, nervous little smile and looked down at her plate. She played the part of the intimidated, out-of-her-depth plebeian perfectly. A month before the wedding, Harrison and Emily summoned Josephine to the towering glass skyscraper that housed Sterling Global Investments. They didn't invite Theo. Waiting for her in a cold, slate-gray boardroom was William Kensington, the family's notoriously ruthless attorney. On the table sat a prenuptial agreement the size of a phone book. "We will be blunt, miss." "Calloway," William said, pushing the document toward her. "The Sterling family protects its assets. This agreement states that in the event of a divorce, you are entitled to nothing. No alimony, no property, no stock options. You leave with exactly what you brought into this marriage, which, as I understand it, is a struggling flower shop and some debt. Emily leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with malice. We know what you are, Josephine. You might have Theo fooled with this wide-eyed, innocent act, but you haven't fooled us. Sign it, or there will be no wedding, and we will make sure your little shop is crushed under a mountain of zoning violations by next week. They expected her to argue. They expected her to cry, to demand a lawyer of her own, to show her true colors, and fight for a slice of the pie. Instead, Josephine reached into her purse, pulled out a cheap ballpoint pen, and flipped to the signature page. I don't need Theo's money, she said softly, signing her name with a fluid, elegant flourish. I'm marrying him for love. Emily scoffed loudly. Harrison looked almost disappointed that she had folded so easily. William Kensington snatched the document back, looking at her as if she were a remarkably stupid insect. As Josephine walked out of the skyscraper and onto the busy Manhattan street, she slipped her cheap pen back into her bag. Once she was out of sight of the security cameras, the fragile, submissive posture vanished entirely. Her spine straightened, her soft, nervous eyes hardened into something cold and terrifyingly sharp. She had signed the prenup without hesitation, not out of naive love, but because she had drafted the core clauses of it herself, funneling them to William Kensington through a dummy legal firm weeks ago. She needed that specific prenup. She needed the Sterling family's lawyers to legally declare in ironclad ink that Josephine Calloway's finances were utterly, permanently severed from the Sterling family estate. Because what the Sterlings didn't know, what no one in the world knew, was that Josephine Calloway was not a florist. She was a forensic auditor, and she was the daughter of Thomas Calloway, the man Harrison Sterling had illegally ruined, bankrupted, and driven to an early grave 20 years ago. Josephine wasn't there to steal the Sterling fortune. She was there to execute a financial demolition, and she needed that prenup to ensure that when the Sterling Empire went up in flames, she wouldn't catch a single spark. The wedding was an obscenely lavish affair at the Plaza Hotel. Emily Sterling wore a gown so pale it was undeniably white, a petty microaggression that the society pages eagerly documented. Brenna spent the evening loudly whispering to anyone who would listen that the bride's dress looked like it was purchased off the rack. Josephine floated through the evening with a serene, oblivious smile, playing the grateful commoner. She danced with Theo, who looked at her with genuine adoration, completely blind to the venom swirling around them. Life inside the Sterling's Manhattan penthouse was an exercise in psychological endurance. Josephine was the lady of the house, in name only. Emily still held the reins, dictating the menus, the decor, and the social calendar. The household staff, loyal to the matriarch, treated Josephine with a barely veiled condescension. "Oh, Josephine, dear," Emily would coo, dropping by unannounced. "I see you've moved the Ming vase. Let's put it back. You just don't have the eye for provenance, darling. It's an acquired taste." "Of course, Emily," Josephine would reply gently. "I'm still learning." Brenna was far more direct in her malice. She would intentionally leave Josephine off the guest lists for high society luncheons, accidentally spill red wine on Josephine's limited designer wardrobe, and constantly reference Theo's glamorous ex-girlfriends. "Did you know Arabella is back in town?" Brenna remarked one evening, over cocktails in the study. "Theo, you remember Arabella, Daddy's hedge fund partner's daughter? She's a partner at Goldman now. Brains, beauty, and breeding, the Holy Trinity." She looked pointedly at Josephine. "Some men settle, but it's such a shame." Theo sighed, rubbing his temples. Drop it." Josephine merely smiled, taking a sip of her water. "It sounds like she's very accomplished," she said smoothly. "They thought she was weak. They thought she was a dim-witted pawn, content to suffer their abuse in exchange for a platinum credit card and a chauffeur. They had no idea what happened when the penthouse went completely quiet. At 2 a.m., while Theo slept deeply beside her, Josephine would slip out of bed. She would bypass the heavy oak doors of Harrison's private home office, a room she was strictly forbidden to enter. She didn't need a key. She had cloned the RFID tag on Harrison's key ring weeks ago. Inside the dark, mahogany-paneled room, Josephine was in her element. She wasn't the naive florist anymore. She was a ghost in their machine. Harrison Sterling was arrogant. Like many men of his generation, he mistrusted cloud storage for his most sensitive, highly illegal ledgers, preferring a localized server hidden behind a false wall in his study. He thought an air-gapped system was impenetrable. He didn't account for someone having physical access to his keyboard. In the dead of night, illuminated only by the glow of a micro-flashlight, Josephine installed hardware keyloggers into the back of his desktop. She copied encrypted drives onto specialized thumb drives, hidden inside tubes of her lipstick. The data she was uncovering was breathtaking in its corruption. Sterling Global Investments was largely a house of cards. Harrison had been running a sophisticated, layered Ponzi scheme for a decade. He was using funds from new international investors to pay off the dividends of the old guard, masking the gaping holes in his balance sheets with artificially inflated real estate valuations in Dubai and London. More importantly, she tracked the shell companies. Harrison was siphoning millions into anonymous offshore trusts in the Seychelles and the Cayman Islands, evading taxes and hiding assets from his own board of directors. Every night, Josephine compiled this data. Every morning, she sent it via encrypted, untraceable relays to her silent partner, Charles Montgomery. Charles was a shark of a financial attorney in London, a man who had been a junior partner to her father before Harrison Sterling ruined him. Together, they had spent 5 years planning this operation. The idiot is moving the money into the Aegis Trust, Josephine typed into a secure chat window one morning at 4 a.m., sitting in the master bathroom while the shower ran to mask the sound of her typing. Then we are right on schedule, Charles typed back. I've established the proxy entities. The moment he looks for a lifeline, we will be the ones holding the rope. Make sure the terms of the debt are tied to his personal collateral, not just the firm, Josephine replied. I want everything. The houses, the cars, his mother's art collection. It will be airtight, Josie. Keep playing the dutiful wife. He suspects nothing? He thinks I'm trying to learn how to knit, she typed, a smirk playing on her lips. During the day, Josephine accelerated her act. She began visiting Theo at the Sterling offices, bringing him homemade lunches. She would sit quietly in the corner of his sprawling office, flipping through bridal magazines or reading gardening books, entirely ignored by the executives who marched in and out. But she was listening. She was memorizing names, dates, and figures. One afternoon, she watched Theo frantically reviewing a spreadsheet, his face pale, his tie loosened. The markets had taken a sharp dip, and Sterling Global was suddenly dangerously over-leveraged. Theo, she asked, walking over and placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. You look so stressed, darling. Is everything okay? He sighed heavily, leaning back. It's just business, Josie. Complex stuff. We have a liquidity issue. A lot of our capital is tied up in long-term developments, and some short-term notes are coming due. My father is. He's scrambling. Oh, Josephine said, her eyes wide with innocent concern. Like, you owe people money, but you don't have the cash right now? Like when my shop's flower distributor needed payment before Valentine's Day? Theo let out a hollow laugh. Yes, exactly like that. Just add a few zeros. A few 100 million zeros. Well, she said, trailing her fingers through his hair. When that happened to me, I just took out a quick bridge loan from a private lender. It held me over until the Valentine's rush. I know it's not the same, but surely your father has friends in Europe who could offer a private, quiet loan just to bridge the gap until your real estate sells? Theo froze. He looked up at her, blinking. The idea was simple, almost brutally rudimentary, but Harrison had been too proud to ask his immediate circle, fearing it would show weakness. An anonymous, private European syndicate, however, that would keep the wolves off Wall Street from smelling blood. Josie, Theo said slowly, that's actually not a terrible idea. An anonymous, private equity injection, a bridge loan. I'm sure you guys will figure it out. She smiled sweetly, kissing his forehead. "You're all so smart." She walked out of the office, her heart beating a steady, victorious rhythm. The seed was planted. The prey was moving exactly toward the trap. It took Harrison Sterling less than 2 weeks to realize his son's idea was his only salvation. Sterling Global was hemorrhaging cash. Margin calls were flooding in, and the SEC was beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about their quarterly filings. The family was quietly panicked. Dinners at the Greenwich estate became tense, silent affairs. Emily tried to maintain appearances, hosting a lavish gala for a prominent museum, but the strain was visible around her eyes. Brenna spent her time aggressively shopping, sensing subconsciously that her unlimited well of funds might be drying up, charging hundreds of thousands to the family accounts in a single week. Josephine played the supportive anchor. She rubbed Theo's back when he came home at 1 a.m., smelling of scotch and stress. She poured Harrison his coffee when he stayed over at the penthouse, enduring his foul moods without complaint. Through Charles Montgomery, Josephine's trap was fully constructed. Operating behind a labyrinth of anonymous LLCs and Swiss intermediaries, Charles presented a lifeline to Harrison Sterling, a $500 million private bridge loan from a shadowy consortium called the Vanguard European Trust. The interest rate was steep, but not extortionate. However, the covenants, the legal conditions of the loan, were utterly draconian. It required not just the assets of Sterling Global as collateral, but the personal, global assets of the Sterling family. Their homes, their personal offshore accounts, their art collections. Furthermore, it included a immediate call clause, buried deep in page 400 of the legal jargon. If the Vanguard Trust found any evidence of financial malfeasance or fraud within Sterling Global, they could instantly call the debt in full, freezing all collateral simultaneously without a court order. Harrison, desperate and arrogant, believing his fraudulent books were perfectly hidden, signed the agreement. The day the $500 million hit the Sterling accounts, the atmosphere in the penthouse shifted from despair to euphoric arrogance. Harrison strutted through the halls like a conquering king. "I told you, Theo," Harrison boasted, swirling a glass of 50-year-old Macallan. "The market tests the strong, and the strong survive. These European bankers are fools. We'll use their money to plug the holes, sell off the Dubai assets, and pay them back before Christmas." "You did it, Dad," Theo smiled, visibly relieved. Brenna sneered from the sofa. "Thank God. I was terrified. I was going to have to fly commercial to Street Bart's next month." She glanced at Josephine, who was quietly arranging lilies in a vase. "You wouldn't understand this kind of stress, Josephine. Being responsible for billions of dollars. It must be so nice to just arrange weeds all day and live off our success." "It is a very peaceful life, Brenna," Josephine agreed softly, cutting a stem with sharp silver shears. "Snip. I'm very lucky." But Josephine knew the truth. Harrison wasn't plugging holes. Old habits die hard. The moment the $500 million came in, Harrison took $50 million of it and funneled it straight into his personal, secret accounts in the Caymans. He was skimming from his own bailout. It was exactly what Josephine needed. The definitive, undeniable proof of fraud occurring after the loan was signed. She documented the transfer. She had the routing numbers, the IP addresses, the timestamps. She bundled the entire data packet, along with the 5 years of evidence proving the Ponzi scheme, and sent it to Charles in London. "It's done," she texted, from a burner phone in the guest bathroom. "He breached the covenant. Execute the freeze." "Understood," Charles replied a minute later, initiating the immediate call clause, sending the dossiers to the SEC, the IRS, and the FBI simultaneously. "It will take a few hours for the global banking networks to process the freeze orders. Enjoy the fireworks, Josie." That evening was the pinnacle of the New York social season, the Met Gala. The Sterling family arrived in a fleet of black SUVs. Emily was dripping in diamonds, her chin held high, ready to reclaim her throne as the undisputed queen of high society. Theo looked handsome and relaxed in his tuxedo, Brenna was draped in a custom gown that cost more than a small house. And Josephine? She walked a few paces behind them, wearing a stunning, minimalist black dress she had bought herself, free of the ostentatious jewels the Sterlings flaunted. They entered the Waldorf Astoria for the pre-gala charity auction, an exclusive event where the city's billionaires flexed their wealth for a good cause. The room was a sea of silk, champagne, and flashing cameras. Harrison and Emily immediately began working the room, boasting about their recent, mysterious influx of capital, assuring their peers that Sterling Global was stronger than ever. An hour into the event, the auctioneer took the stage. The grand prize was a week-long stay on a private island in the Maldives, complete with a private jet and staff. Emily, desperate to show the room that the Sterlings were untouchable, raised her paddle aggressively. 1.5 million, she called out, her voice cutting through the chatter. 2 million, a rival hedge fund manager shot back. Emily scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. 2.5 million, the room applauded. The auctioneer banged his gavel. Sold. To Mrs. Emily Sterling. Emily glided toward the payment terminal set up near the stage. A smug smile plastered across her face. She pulled a heavy, black titanium card from her clutch and handed it to the attendant. Such a wonderful cause, Emily projected loudly for the nearby reporters. The attendant swiped the card. The machine beeped. The attendant frowned, looking at the screen. I'm sorry, Mrs. Sterling. It seems to have been declined. Emily let out a sharp, aristocratic laugh. Don't be ridiculous. It's a black card. Run it again. The machine must be faulty. The attendant swiped it again. Beep. Declined. A murmur began to ripple through the crowd standing nearby. Emily's smile tightened into a grimace. Here, she snapped, pulling out a different card. Use the platinum. The attendant swiped it. Beep. Account frozen. Please contact issuing bank. The attendant looked up, his face pale. Ma'am, this one says frozen. Emily's blood ran cold. Across the room, Harrison was suddenly looking at his phone, his face draining of all color. Brenna was frantically tapping on her screen, loudly complaining that her banking app was locked out. And standing near the grand ice sculpture, holding a single glass of club soda, was Josephine. She watched as Emily's phone began to vibrate violently, then Harrison's, then Theo's. Notifications from banks in Geneva, London, New York, and the Caymans, all delivering the exact same, automated, terrifying message. All assets frozen pending legal inquiry. Accounts locked under Vanguard Trust Covenant Clause 8.4. Josephine met Emily's panicked, wide-eyed stare across the crowded ballroom. The older woman looked utterly confused, completely unmoored. Josephine didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply raised her glass, tipped it slightly in Emily's direction, and took a slow sip. The florist had just bought the entire garden, and she was about to burn it to the ground. The silence that followed the declined card at the Waldorf Astoria was not actual silence. It was the deafening, collective intake of breath from 50 of New York's wealthiest power brokers. Emily Sterling's face cycled through shades of crimson and stark white. She snatched the platinum card from the attendant's trembling hand, her acrylic nails digging into the plastic. There is a glitch in your archaic system, she hissed, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and sheer terror. Harrison, call Preston at Chase Private Client immediately. This is utterly absurd. But Harrison wasn't listening. He was staring at his iPhone screen, his thumb frantically swiping through a cascade of red alerts. His accounts at Chase, his offshore holdings with UBS, his secretive trusts at Cayman National, every single application displayed the same chilling error code. Access denied. Assets frozen. Contact legal counsel. Theo pushed through the crowd, his brow furrowed. Dad? What's going on? My Amex Black was just declined at the bar. Josephine materialized at Theo's side, slipping her arm through his. She looked the picture of a concerned, bewildered spouse. Theo, darling, is everything all right? Your mother looks like she's seen a ghost. I don't know, Josie, Theo muttered, his eyes darting around the room. The whispers had already begun. The rival hedge fund manager, who had bid against Emily, was smirking behind his champagne flute. In their world, liquidity was oxygen. To be caught without it in public was social execution. "We are leaving," Harrison barked, grabbing Emily by the elbow with enough force to make her wince. Now, the ride back to the Greenwich estate was suffocating. Brenna, who had been abruptly cut off from a massive online purchase at Bergdorf Goodman mid-gala, was practically hyperventilating in the back of the Escalade. "Daddy, fix this," she shrieked. "My stylist is holding a vintage Birkin for me, and my card bounced. Do you know how humiliating that is? I looked like a peasant." "Shut up, Brenna," Harrison roared, his usual patrician composure completely shattering. He had the speakerphone activated, listening to the agonizing hold music of a high-level Swiss banking liaison. When the banker finally clicked over, his tone was strictly procedural, devoid of the usual sycophantic warmth Harrison was accustomed to. "Mr. Sterling, I cannot provide details over an unsecured line. However, I can confirm a global asset freeze has been initiated by the primary creditor of the Vanguard Trust, citing Covenant Clause 8.4. Furthermore, sir, we have received a subpoena from the Securities and Exchange Commission." Harrison dropped the phone. It clattered against the leather floorboards. "The SEC?" Emily whispered, the diamonds at her throat suddenly looking like a heavy, glittering noose. "Harrison, what did you do?" "Nothing," he snapped, though the sweat pooling on his forehead told a different story. "It's a misunderstanding. The Europeans are getting jumpy. I'll have Kensington squash it by breakfast." But there would be no squashing it. At 6 a.m. the next morning, Josephine sat at the massive marble kitchen island, quietly sipping Earl Grey tea and watching the sunrise over the manicured lawns. She heard the distinct, heavy crunch of tires on gravel. Not one car, but a dozen. She stood up, tying her silk robe tighter, and walked to the front window. A fleet of dark, unmarked sedans and 2 white vans had swarmed the circular driveway. Men and women in windbreakers, bearing the letters FBI and IRS, poured out, heavily armed and moving with practiced efficiency. Josephine walked to the base of the grand staircase and let out a perfectly calibrated, terrified scream. "Theo! Harrison! Oh my God, wake up!" Within minutes, the Greenwich estate was a crime scene. Federal agents seized computers, cracked the safe in Harrison's study, and boxed up decades of financial records. Harrison, still wearing his silk pajamas, screamed empty threats at a stone-faced FBI unit chief named Agent Miller. "You have no jurisdiction here. I am Harrison Sterling. You are destroying a pillar of the American economy." "We have a federal warrant, Mr. Sterling," Agent Miller replied coolly, handing him a thick stack of papers, signed by Judge Rosenthal at 3 a.m. "We also have coordinated raids, currently executing, at the Sterling Global Headquarters in Manhattan. You are suspected of massive wire fraud, tax evasion, and operating a multi-billion-dollar Ponzi scheme. I suggest you call your lawyer." Theo looked like he was going to be sick. He slumped against the wall, watching agents carry out boxes of hard drives. He looked at Josephine, who was huddled in the corner, clutching her robe, playing the traumatized civilian to absolute perfection. "Josie," Theo rasped, reaching out for her. "I don't understand. My dad. He wouldn't. The bridge loan was supposed to save us." Josephine rushed to his side, wrapping her arms around him, burying her face in his chest to hide her cold, unblinking eyes. "It's going to be okay, Theo," she whispered. "We'll figure this out. The truth will come out." It was the only honest thing she had said to him in a year. By noon, the news had broken on Bloomberg, CNBC, and the front page of the Wall Street Journal. Sterling empire crumbles. Feds raid offices amid Ponzi allegations. The family was financially paralyzed. They couldn't hire crisis PR. Their retainers bounced. They couldn't flee. Their passports had been surrendered. Even the household staff, sensing the end, began quietly packing their bags and leaving, taking a few pieces of silver with them for unpaid severance. For 48 hours, the Sterlings were trapped in their sprawling mansion, relying on the pantry staples because they literally could not afford to order a pizza. On the third day of the freeze, William Kensington, the family's high-priced, morally flexible attorney, arrived at the Greenwich estate. He looked exhausted, his tie undone, his briefcase bulging. The family gathered in the formal living room. Harrison paced like a caged tiger. Emily sat rigidly on the sofa, clutching a lukewarm cup of coffee. Brenna was weeping softly into a cashmere throw. Josephine sat quietly next to Theo, holding his hand. "Talk to me, William," Harrison demanded. "Tell me you've filed an injunction against Vanguard. Tell me we have access to the Cayman operating accounts." Kensington shook his head slowly. "Harrison, it's worse than we thought. Much worse." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick dossier. "I finally made contact with the legal representation for the Vanguard Trust. Vanguard isn't a European syndicate. It's a shell company, a proxy." "A proxy for who?" Emily snapped. "Some rival firm? Is it Goldman? Are they trying a hostile takeover?" "No," a crisp, refined British accent echoed from the grand foyer. Everyone turned. Standing in the doorway, flanked by two imposing private security guards, was Charles Montgomery. He wore a perfectly tailored Savile Row suit, carrying a sleek leather portfolio. Harrison squinted. "Who the hell are you? How did you get in here?" "The front door was wide open, Harrison. Your security detail seems to have abandoned their posts due to lack of payment," Charles said, stepping into the room. "My name is Charles Montgomery. I am the senior partner at Montgomery and Croft in London, and I represent the sole director and creditor of the Vanguard Trust." Harrison lunged forward, but Kensington held him back. You're the bastard who authorized the freeze. We had a deal. We were making the interest payments." "You breached the covenants, Mr. Sterling," Charles said calmly, opening his portfolio and dropping a stack of glossy photographs and bank transfer logs onto the coffee table. "Within 24 hours of receiving the $500 million capital injection, you diverted $50 million to an undisclosed personal offshore account in the Cayman Islands under the name Aegis Holdings. That is a direct violation of Covenant 8.4, constituting immediate fraud." Theo stared at the documents, his face ashen. "Dad, tell me that's a lie. Tell me you didn't steal from our own bailout." Harrison swallowed hard, avoiding his son's gaze. "It was a strategic reserve, Theo. Business is complicated." "It's theft," Charles corrected smoothly, "and it triggered the immediate call clause. You now owe the Vanguard Trust the full principal, plus the punitive penalty fees, totaling $600 million, due instantly, and since your assets are frozen and currently being seized by the federal government, you are in default." Emily stood up, her voice shrill. "You can't do this. We have friends in Washington. We will tie you up in litigation for decades." Charles offered a thin, aristocratic smile. "I'm afraid you have no money to pay for that litigation, Mrs. Sterling. We own your debt. We hold the liens on this house, the Manhattan penthouse, the cars, and the art. We are foreclosing on everything. By tomorrow morning, you are legally evicted." Brenna let out a wail of despair. Theo buried his face in his hands. "I want to see the director of this trust," Harrison growled, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. "If some coward is going to ruin my family, I want them to look me in the eye." "Who is pulling your strings, Montgomery?" "That won't be a problem, Harrison," Charles said, stepping aside. The room fell dead silent. They waited for a ruthless Wall Street titan to walk through the door, a rival billionaire, a vengeful politician. Instead, Josephine simply let go of Theo's hand. She stood up from the sofa. She didn't look scared anymore. The soft, submissive posture she had carried for a year vanished, replaced by a spine of absolute steel. She smoothed the skirt of her dress, walked over to Charles Montgomery, and turned to face the Sterling family. "Hello, Harrison," Josephine said. Her voice was no longer the soft, breathless whisper of a Brooklyn florist. It was cold, sharp, and resonant with absolute authority. Emily blinked, utterly confused. "Josephine, what are you doing? Get away from him. He's the enemy." Theo looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "Josie, what is going on?" Josephine looked at Theo, and for a fleeting second, a shadow of pity crossed her face, but it was quickly buried under a glacier of resolve. I'm sorry, Theo, but I am the director of the Vanguard Trust. The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible. That's insane, Brenna scoffed, wiping her nose. You arrange flowers. You're broke. I am a forensic auditor, Josephine corrected, her eyes locking onto Harrison. And my real name is Josephine Calloway. Does that name ring a bell, Harrison? It should. 20 years ago, my father, Thomas Calloway, ran a boutique investment firm in Chicago. You partnered with him. You used his accounts to run your first illegal trades. And when the authorities caught on, you framed him. You destroyed his reputation, bankrupted our family, and left him to take the fall. Harrison's face went slack. The color completely drained from his cheeks. Thomas, Calloway's daughter. He died of a heart attack 2 years later, fighting the legal battles you left him with, Josephine continued, her voice dangerously quiet. My mother worked 3 jobs to keep us off the street. I spent the last 10 years tracking every single dirty dollar you ever moved, Harrison. Charles and I built the Vanguard Trust specifically for you. The bridge loan was bait, and you were arrogant enough to swallow the hook, the line, and the sinker. You little bitch, Emily hissed, her face contorted in pure, unadulterated hatred. She turned to Kensington. William, she's married to Theo. If she owns this trust, then it's a marital asset. We can claim half of it. We can unfreeze the accounts. William Kensington looked sick. He slowly opened his briefcase again, pulling out a familiar, thick document. Emily, Kensington said, his voice trembling. I can't. What do you mean you can't? Emily screamed. The prenuptial agreement, Kensington whispered, sliding it across the table. The one you forced her to sign. Josephine smiled a sharp, terrifying smile. Yes, the prenuptial agreement, the one that explicitly states that in the event of a divorce, all my assets, businesses, and holdings remain entirely separate from the Sterling family estate. The one that guarantees that Theo, and by extension you, have zero legal right to anything I own, including the Vanguard Trust. Emily stared at the document, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. You insisted it be ironclad, Emily, Josephine said, twisting the knife. You wanted to make sure I couldn't touch your money. You never stopped to consider that I was making sure you couldn't touch mine. This is fraud, Harrison roared, spit flying from his lips. You manipulated us. I didn't forge your ledgers, Harrison, Josephine shot back, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. I didn't force you to steal from your own investors. I didn't force you to embezzle that $50 million. All I did was give you a rope. You chose to hang yourself with it. She looked down at Theo. He was staring at her, as if she were a stranger. The betrayal in his eyes was absolute. I loved you, he whispered, his voice cracking. I actually loved you, Josie. I know, Josephine said softly, and that was the only part of this that I regret. But you built your entire life on a mountain of stolen money, Theo. Your father broke my family. I just leveled the playing field. She turned to Charles. Are the eviction notices finalized? Signed and stamped by the court this morning, Charles confirmed. They have until 8 a.m. tomorrow to vacate the premises. Josephine looked back at the Sterling family, the mighty, untouchable billionaires, now reduced to terrified, bankrupt ghosts, sitting in a house they no longer owned. Pack your bags, Josephine said coldly. And please, leave the silver. It doesn't belong to you anymore. The morning of the eviction, the skies over Greenwich, Connecticut, were the color of bruised iron. By 7 a.m., the perimeter of the Sterling estate was entirely barricaded by news vans. The New York Post, Bloomberg, Vanity Fair, and a swarm of independent paparazzi had descended upon the wrought iron gates like vultures sensing a fresh carcass. At exactly 8 a.m., the gates swung open, not to let a Maybach out, but to let a fleet of U-Haul trucks and federal marshals in. Emily Sterling, a woman who had once dictated the social hierarchy of Manhattan with the flick of a Cartier-adorned wrist, walked out the front doors carrying 2 canvas duffel bags. Her face was hidden behind oversized Chanel sunglasses, but her hands shook violently. Brenna followed, sobbing openly, dragging a single Louis Vuitton trunk that had survived the asset seizure only because it contained her childhood retainers and high school yearbooks. Harrison did not walk out. He was escorted out in handcuffs by Agent Miller. Overnight, the Department of Justice had revoked his temporary release, citing a credible flight risk after Charles Montgomery provided encrypted flight logs showing Harrison had quietly chartered a private jet to a non-extradition country the evening before. The photographs of the Sterling perp walk broke the internet, but it was the story of the mastermind behind it all that truly captivated the globe. The media dubbed Josephine the Trojan horse bride. Talk shows dissected her every move, analyzing footage of her at galas, standing quietly in the background in her thrifted dresses while the Sterlings flaunted stolen wealth. She became an overnight anti-hero, a brilliant, calculating avenger who had weaponized high society's own arrogance against itself. The criminal trial of Harrison Sterling began 6 months later in the Southern District of New York. It was a bloodbath. Harrison's high-powered defense attorney, Jonathan Pierce, tried desperately to spin the narrative. He attempted to paint Josephine as a malicious corporate spy, a grifter who had manipulated a vulnerable, well-meaning patriarch. But Josephine's meticulous record-keeping left no room for doubt. When called to the witness stand, she didn't wear designer clothes. She wore a simple, tailored, gray suit. For 3 grueling days, under intense cross-examination, she dismantled Harrison's defense piece by piece. She walked the jury through the complex web of shell companies, the falsified Dubai real estate valuations, and the tragic list of innocent investors, pension funds, small-town charities, and families like her own that Harrison had bled dry. Then came the final twist, the moment that truly shattered whatever remained of the Sterling family. Facing a guaranteed life sentence, Harrison did what a narcissist always does when cornered. He turned on his own blood. On the 4th day of the trial, Harrison's defense team submitted a motion claiming that Harrison was suffering from early-onset dementia and that the true architect of the recent Cayman Islands embezzlement and the Vanguard Trust default was his son, Theodore. A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom as Harrison pointed a trembling finger at Theo, who was sitting in the gallery. "My son," Harrison wept, producing crocodile tears for the jury. "He handled the digital transfers. He made the Vanguard deal. I trusted him with the keys to the kingdom, and he destroyed us." Theo looked like he had been physically struck. His own father was throwing him to the wolves, attempting to hand him a 20-year federal prison sentence to shave a few years off his own. Josephine sat at the prosecution's table, her face an unreadable mask. She knew Theo was weak. She knew he was complicit in enjoying the fruits of a poisoned tree, willfully ignoring the red flags of his family's wealth. But she also knew he wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was just a spoiled, naive boy, desperate for his father's approval. The prosecutor, David Carmichael, leaned over to Josephine. "If we let Harrison push this narrative, it might introduce enough reasonable doubt about his mental state to get him a lighter sentence. We need the smoking gun on the Cayman transfer." Josephine closed her eyes. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a single, encrypted flash drive. "I have the biometrics," she said quietly. When she took the stand again, she projected a log file onto the courtroom screens. It wasn't just IP addresses and routing numbers. It was the keystroke dynamics and fingerprint authorization logs from Harrison's private, air-gapped server. Theodore Sterling did not authorize the illegal transfer of the $50 million, Josephine stated firmly, her voice echoing in the silent room. The biometric lock on the terminal confirms that the transfer was executed by a user with a right index fingerprint matching Harrison Sterling. Furthermore, the keystroke rhythm, the speed and pressure of the typing, matches Harrison's historical data with a 99.8% certainty. Theo wasn't even in the building. GPS records show he was at a florist shop in Brooklyn, buying his wife a bouquet. She looked at Theo. He was staring back at her, tears streaming down his face. She had ruined his life, but she had just saved him from a prison cell. Harrison's defense collapsed instantly. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, guilty on all 74 counts. Judge Marilyn Rosenberg was not a woman who suffered fools, and she had a particular, razor-sharp disdain for men in bespoke suits who stole from the working class. The courtroom was packed to the gallery rafters on the day of sentencing. Harrison Sterling sat at the defense table, but he was unrecognizable. The golden patriarch of Manhattan was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out, trembling old man in an ill-fitting orange jumpsuit. His skin was sallow. His arrogance had entirely evaporated the moment the guilty verdicts were read. Harrison Sterling, Judge Rosenberg boomed, her voice cutting through the heavy silence of the federal courtroom. You did not build a business. You built a monument to your own towering ego, using the bricks of ruined lives, stolen pensions, and shattered families. You operated with a callous, predatory entitlement that defies comprehension, and when cornered, you attempted to feed your own son to the federal government to save your own skin. She paused, looking down at him, over her glasses, with absolute disgust. I am sentencing you to 150 years in federal prison. You will serve this time at ADX Florence, a maximum security facility. There will be no country club accommodations for you, Mr. Sterling. You will leave this courtroom today, and you will never walk as a free man again. The strike of her gavel sounded like a gunshot. Harrison didn't even protest as the federal marshals hauled him to his feet. He simply stared blankly ahead, a ghost being led to his tomb. The fallout for the rest of the Sterling family was a brutal, agonizing masterclass in poetic justice. They had defined themselves entirely by their wealth. Without it, they simply ceased to exist in the circles they once ruled. Emily Sterling, completely stripped of her assets, her credit lines, and her pride, found herself a social pariah. The Upper East Side socialites who had once air-kissed her cheeks at the Met Gala now actively crossed the street to avoid her. With nowhere else to go, Emily was forced to sign a lease on a cramped, fourth-floor walk-up apartment in Astoria, Queens. The radiators clanked violently in the winter, and the hallways smelled permanently of boiled cabbage and bleach. To survive, the former queen of New York society had to find employment. At 62, Emily took a job as an administrative assistant at a mid-tier, high-volume real estate brokerage in Brooklyn. Her manager was a 26-year-old woman named Chloe, who frequently mispronounced Emily's name and loudly reprimanded her for making the office coffee too weak. Emily spent her days filing eviction notices and answering ringing phones, her acrylic nails long gone, her hands shaking as she calculated how to stretch a MetroCard balance until payday. Brenna's reality check was equally devastating. With no trust fund to drain and a last name that was entirely toxic, she attempted to leverage her old lifestyle into a career as an online influencer. It was a spectacular failure. The internet, armed with the knowledge of her family's crimes, relentlessly mocked her budget lifestyle videos. Desperate for a lifeline, Brenna eventually married Gary, a 65-year-old, twice-divorced regional manager of a plumbing supply chain in New Jersey. They had their reception at a sad, fluorescent-lit banquet hall off the turnpike. Brenna wore an off-the-rack dress, staring blankly at her cubic zirconia engagement ring, trapped in a loud, aggressively mediocre suburban life, forever chasing the ghost of her former glory. As for the fortune, Josephine did not keep a single dime. She had never been fighting for a payout. She was fighting for a leveling of the scales. Working relentlessly with Charles Montgomery, Josephine oversaw the complete liquidation of the Vanguard Trust portfolio. The Greenwich estate was sold to a tech billionaire who immediately gutted the interior. Emily's beloved art collection, which, upon appraisal, turned out to contain several extremely convincing forgeries Harrison had purchased to save money, was auctioned off for a fraction of its insured value. The luxury cars, the offshore accounts, the private jets, everything was liquidated into cold, hard cash. Josephine took the nearly $2.4 billion, recovered, and established the Callaway Restitution Fund. Over the next 2 years, the fund operated with surgical precision. They tracked down every single victim of Harrison's Ponzi scheme. Josephine personally signed the letters that went out across the globe. They restored the gutted pension funds of public school teachers in Ohio. They refunded the endowments of small, local charities that had been forced to close. And, most importantly to Josephine, she quietly restored the estate of Thomas Callaway, securing her mother's financial future so she would never have to work a night shift again. 3 years after the trial concluded, on a crisp, golden autumn afternoon, the brass bell above the door of a Brooklyn floral shop jingled. The shop had changed. It was no longer the struggling, cramped space it used to be. Josephine had expanded, knocking down the wall to the adjacent storefront, filling the airy, sunlit space with vibrant, rare orchids, trailing pothos, and lush greenery. Josephine stood behind the heavy oak counter, wiping damp soil from her hands onto her canvas apron. She looked up toward the door and froze. Standing in the entryway was Theo. He looked drastically different. The bespoke Italian suits and the arrogant posture of a billionaire heir were entirely gone. He wore a simple, slightly frayed wool peacoat over a plain gray sweater and well-worn jeans. There were lines of exhaustion around his eyes, and his hands, once impeccably manicured, looked rough and calloused. "Hello, Josie," he said. His voice was soft, devoid of the bitterness she had expected. "Theo," she replied, her guard immediately rising, her posture stiffening. "What are you doing here?" He walked slowly toward the counter, his eyes scanning the thriving plants around them. "I was in the neighborhood. I got a job. I'm a financial counselor for a nonprofit in the South Bronx now. I help low-income families navigate debt consolidation and predatory loans." He offered a small, self-deprecating smile. "The pay is absolutely terrible, but the work, it lets me sleep at night." Josephine's rigid posture softened just a fraction. "I'm genuinely glad to hear that, Theo. I wanted to come see you to say thank you," he continued, looking down at his worn boots before meeting her eyes again. "I hated you for a long time, Josie. I thought you were a monster. I thought you were the villain who destroyed my family. But I've had 3 years of therapy and a lot of quiet nights in a one-bedroom apartment to think about it. You didn't break us. We were already rotten to the core. You just turned on the lights." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small clipping from a financial newspaper. It was an article about the Callaway Restitution Fund finalizing its last payout to a group of elderly investors. "You gave it all back," he whispered, placing the clipping on the counter. "Every cent. You even paid back the people my father ruined before I was even born." He paused, his voice cracking slightly. "And I know what you did at the trial. With the biometric logs, my lawyer told me later that if you hadn't produced that specific data, the jury might have believed my father's lies. I might be sitting in a cell in Florence right now instead of him. You saved me, Josie." Josephine looked at the clipping, a heavy lump forming in her throat. She had spent years turning her heart into a weapon of pure, unadulterated vengeance. But looking at Theo now, a man stripped of his toxic legacy, finally trying to build something real, she realized the war was truly over. "Your father took everything from my family, Theo," she said softly, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I couldn't let another family feel that pain, but I am sorry you got caught in the crossfire. I really am." "I wasn't in the crossfire," Theo corrected gently, shaking his head. "I was standing right in the line of fire, enjoying the warmth of a burning building. I needed to get burned to wake up." He reached into his coat one last time and pulled out a single, perfect white orchid stem, laying it gently on the oak counter. "Take care of yourself, Josephine." "You too, Theo," she whispered. He turned and walked out of the shop, the bell jingling cheerfully in his wake. He stepped out into the busy Brooklyn street, pulling his collar up against the autumn chill, and disappeared into the crowd, just another ordinary man making his way in the city. Josephine watched him go for a long moment. Then she picked up the white orchid. She walked over to the front window, where the late afternoon sun was pouring in, and placed it carefully into a tall, clear glass vase. The Sterling Empire was nothing more than dust and cautionary tales now, but from the ashes, something real, something honest, had finally managed to bloom. What an absolute roller coaster. From a struggling florist to a brilliant forensic mastermind, Josephine's story proves that karma doesn't just come around. Sometimes it wears a thrifted sweater and drafts a bulletproof prenuptial agreement. Harrison Sterling thought he was untouchable, but he learned the hard way that the people you overlook are often the ones who hold the match to your empire. The ultimate twist of Josephine saving Theo from his own father's betrayal while burning the rest of the legacy to the ground is a masterclass in calculated justice. If this deep dive into the dark, twisty world of high society revenge kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. It helps the channel immensely. Share this video with someone who loves a brilliant, real-life inspired revenge story, and don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our next deep dive into the scandalous secrets of the ultra-rich. What did you think of Josephine's ultimate revenge? Let me know in the comments below.